Ash still stained the creases of Cora's knuckles. She had 2 nickels to her name and a winter storm brewing over the ridge. Then a shadow eclipsed her boarding house doorway. He smelled of horse sweat and pine pitch. He didn't offer romance. He offered a brutal, terrifying transaction. Smoke hung in the valley like a dirty wool blanket. Oakhaven was a town that existed entirely on the mud dragged in by miners and the cheap whiskey poured to wash it down. Cora sat on the edge of a mattress that felt more like a burlap sack full of corn cobs, staring at her hands. The skin was cracked, the nail beds permanently gray. Yesterday, the schoolhouse had caught fire. A rusted stovepipe, a stray spark. And 3 years of her life were reduced to a pile of charred timber smelling of wet ash and roasted slate. The town council, a group of men who smelled perpetually of stale beer and chewing tobacco, had made their position clear that morning. No schoolhouse meant no school. No school meant no teacher. No teacher meant Cora had until the end of the week to vacate the miserable little room above the cooper's shop. She picked up a nickel from the washstand. It was cold. Everything was cold. The wind off the Colorado peaks rattled the single pane of glass in her window. A steady, rhythmic threat. Winter was coming. You didn't survive a mountain winter with 2 nickels and a cotton dress. You froze, quietly and quickly, in an alleyway. Heavy boots hit the stairs outside her door. They didn't tap. They thudded, groaning against the cheap pine boards. Cora stiffened. The knock wasn't polite. It was a single heavy rap that shook the doorframe. "Open up," a voice said. It sounded like gravel rolling around in a tin pan. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the frayed wool offering no real warmth, and unlatched the door. He filled the frame. That was the first thing she noticed. He was unnecessarily large, blocking out the dim hallway light. He didn't wear a tailored suit or a bowler hat like the men from the Eastern Banks. He wore a heavy canvas coat, lined with what looked like wolf fur, stained at the cuffs with dark, old grease. His beard was thick, unruly, and threaded with premature iron gray. He smelled intensely of the outdoors, not the romantic, flowery scent of a meadow, but the sharp, biting odor of wet earth, damp wool, and cold leather. "You the teacher," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was," Cora replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of panic in her hollow stomach. "If you're here about a refund for tuition, the town council holds the funds. Don't care about the council." He stepped inside without being invited. The room instantly felt entirely too small. He looked around, his pale eyes taking in the pathetic stack of her belongings, a single battered trunk, a stack of half-burnt McGuffey readers, a chipped wash basin. "Name is Wyatt. Heard you lost your post. Word travels fast when it's bad news. Only kind of news there is up here." Wyatt stopped in the center of the room. He didn't take off his hat. "I live up on the ridge, 3,000 acres. Got a silver claim that pays, timber that pays better. I got a house built of stone and thick timber. Wind doesn't get in." Cora frowned, crossing her arms. "I am not looking for a real estate lecture, Mr. Wyatt." "Just Wyatt." He stared at her. His gaze wasn't predatory, nor was it kind. It was calculating, like a man assessing a mule for a heavy pack. "I got 2 boys, 7 and 10. Their mother died 4 years ago. Fever. I can keep them fed. I can teach them to shoot. But they're turning feral. They need civilizing. They need a mother." Cora let out a sharp, bitter laugh. It scraped her dry throat. "And you came to town to buy one?" "I came to town for nails and salt pork," he corrected flatly. "But I saw the smoke. Heard the teacher was out on the street. I figure we have a mutual problem." "I am not a problem. You are broke, starving, and about to freeze to death in a mining camp where a woman alone lasts about as long as a snowflake on a hot stove." He didn't blink. He just laid the facts out, like cards on a table. "I need a woman in the house to keep my sons from becoming animals. You need a roof, a fire, and meat on your bones. I'm asking you to marry me." Cora's stomach clenched. A wave of profound, suffocating insult washed over her. She wanted to slap him. She wanted to yell, to demand he get out of her room, to tell him she wasn't a desperate stray dog. But as she drew in a breath to scream, her stomach gave a loud, hollow growl. Wyatt's eyes dropped to her waist, then back up to her face. He didn't smile. He didn't mock her. "I don't know you," she said, the fight leaking out of her, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. "You are a stranger. You live in the middle of nowhere. I'm a hard man, but I'm not a cruel one," Wyatt said softly. The sudden drop in his volume was jarring. "I don't drink. I don't raise my hand to women. I won't expect wifely duties, not unless you want it, which you won't. This is a contract. You raise my boys, teach them to read, make sure they wash behind their ears. In exchange, you never go hungry again. You get your own room. You get a house." Cora looked at the 2 nickels on the washstand. She thought about the men at the saloon who had looked at her differently this morning, knowing she was destitute. The world was a machine of teeth and gears, and right now, she was standing in the cogs. She looked back at the giant of a man smelling of pine pitch and old sweat. "I don't know how to cook," she lied, a pathetic attempt to retain some sliver of control. "You'll learn," he said, "or we'll eat it burnt. Pack your trunk. We leave in an hour." The wagon didn't have springs. Every rock, every rut, every frozen clump of mud jarred straight up through the wooden bench and into the base of Cora's spine. Her teeth had been chattering for the first 2 miles, but now her jaw was just clamped shut, locked in a tight, aching grimace. The town of Oakhaven was a distant smudge of brown against the valley floor. They had been climbing for 3 hours. The air here was different. It was thin, sharp, and stung the inside of her nose with every breath. The pine trees grew thicker, their dark green needles heavy with the threat of snow. Wyatt hadn't spoken since he loaded her trunk. He just drove the team of massive draft horses, his hands wrapped in thick leather gloves, the reins held loosely but with undeniable control. A brutal gust of wind swept down the mountain pass, cutting right through Cora's wool shawl. She shivered violently, her shoulders curling inward. Without looking at her, Wyatt reached behind the bench with one hand, grabbed a massive, tangled mound of fur, and tossed it into her lap. "Buffalo," he grunted. It was heavy. It smelled violently of musk, dust, and something deeply animalistic. It was the grossest thing Cora had ever held. She hated it. She hated him for seeing her shiver. She hated that she had to accept it. She pulled it tightly around her shoulders, burying her chin in the coarse fur. The warmth was immediate and aggressive. She closed her eyes, fighting a sudden, humiliating sting of tears. "I am a married woman," she thought. They had stopped at the magistrate's office on the way out of town. It took 5 minutes. Wyatt had signed his name with blocky, aggressive letters. Cora's signature had been a faint, trembling scrawl. There was no kiss, no ring, just a piece of paper that traded her autonomy for a roof. The wagon lurched around a sharp bend, the wheels terrifyingly close to a sheer drop that vanished into a canopy of dark pines below. Cora gasped, grabbing the edge of the wooden bench, her knuckles white. "Horses know the way," Wyatt said, his voice flat. "They are animals," Cora snapped, the fear making her voice sharp. "They make mistakes. Not these ones." Another hour passed before the trees broke, revealing a wide, sloping plateau carved into the side of the mountain. In the center sat the house. Wyatt hadn't lied. It wasn't a shack. It was a massive structure of peeled logs and river stone, formidable and dark against the gray sky. Smoke curled from a wide stone chimney. Outbuildings, a barn, a smithy, a woodshed dotted the clearing. It was an empire of isolation. Wyatt pulled the team to a halt near the porch. The silence when the wagon stopped was deafening. No town noise, no clinking glasses, no shouting miners, just the wind whining through the pines. "Stay here," Wyatt said, wrapping the reins around the brake lever. He climbed down, his boots crunching on the frozen earth. He walked to the edge of the woods and put 2 fingers in his mouth, letting out a sharp, piercing whistle that echoed off the ridges. Cora waited, clutching the rank buffalo robe. A minute later, 2 figures emerged from the tree line. They didn't look like children. They looked like small, feral woodland creatures. The older one, Caleb, was tall for 10. his hair a tangled mess of dirt-brown knots reaching his shoulders. His clothes were too short, his wrists jutting out of frayed sleeves, smeared with dried mud. The younger one, Seth, trailed behind him, dragging a thick wooden stick. Half his face was covered in a smear of black soot. They stopped 10 feet from the wagon and stared at Cora. Their eyes were identical to Wyatt's, pale, hard, and entirely devoid of warmth. Cora forced a stiff, unnatural smile. "Hello?" Neither boy said a word. Caleb looked at his father. "You brought a woman." "I brought a wife," Wyatt corrected, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Her name is Cora. She's going to live here. She's going to teach you your letters and make sure you don't eat like rabid dogs. You will listen to her." Seth, the 7-year-old, wiped his soot-stained nose with the back of his filthy sleeve. He stared at Cora, his eyes narrowing. Without breaking eye contact, he deliberately spat a wad of saliva onto the frozen dirt. Cora's fake smile vanished. The sheer hostility radiating from the children was a physical weight. She had dealt with unruly students before, farm boys who didn't want to learn their sums. But this wasn't rebellion. This was raw, untamed defiance. Wyatt didn't scold the boy. He just turned to the back of the wagon and hauled Cora's trunk onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. "Show her inside," Wyatt told the boys. "I have to unhitch the team." He walked off toward the barn, leaving her completely alone with them. Cora climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff and aching. The cold earth jarred her bones. She stood before the 2 boys. They didn't move. "Well," Cora said, her voice dropping the high-pitched sweetness she usually reserved for the classroom. She let the exhaustion and the cynicism bleed through. "Are you going to stand there freezing, or are you going to show me the house?" Caleb smirked, a cruel adult expression on a child's face. He turned on his heel and walked up the porch steps. Seth followed, but not before kicking a shower of frozen dirt in the direction of Cora's hem. Cora closed her eyes, took a deep breath of the freezing, pine-scented air, and followed them into the dark. The inside of the cabin was cavernous. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, a hearty fire spitting and hissing, casting long, dancing shadows across the exposed beam ceiling. The heat near the hearth was intense, but it failed entirely to reach the corners of the room, which felt like ice boxes. The smell hit her next. It wasn't the foul stench of decay, but a heavy, oppressive odor of stale bacon grease, wet dog, unwashed clothes, and wood ash. The furniture was heavy and utilitarian. A long oak table, stout chairs, a few animal pelts thrown haphazardly over benches. Dust coated everything in a thick, fuzzy gray layer. It was a house entirely devoid of a woman's touch. There were no curtains, no rugs, no small comforts. It was a fortress built for survival, not a home. Caleb and Seth had retreated to the far side of the room, watching her from the shadows like cornered wolves. "Where is the kitchen area?" Cora asked, refusing to let her voice tremble. Caleb pointed a dirty finger toward a cast-iron wood stove nestled in an alcove near the back. Cora walked over. The counter was sticky. A pile of tin plates, crusted with the remains of yesterday's meal, sat in a wooden basin. She felt a surge of overwhelming despair. She wasn't just a teacher anymore. She was a maid, a cook, a warden. She stripped off her threadbare shawl, rolling up her sleeves. The air in the room was cold enough to see her breath, but she couldn't afford to stand still. She found a pump by the sink, primed it, and pumped freezing water into the basin. She searched the cupboard's rough-hewn shelves holding sacks of flour, tins of coffee, and a large ceramic crock of salt pork. By the time Wyatt walked in an hour later, the cabin smelled slightly better. The scent of lye soap had fought back the bacon grease. Cora had scrubbed the table, washed the tin plates, and was currently staring down the cast-iron stove with sheer terror. She had lied about not knowing how to cook, but only barely. Her mother had died when she was young, and she had survived on boarding house stew and dry bread for years. She found some dried apples and a sack of cornmeal. She attempted to make a hoe cake in a heavy iron skillet, using a dollop of lard that smelled dangerously old. Wyatt hung his coat on a peg by the door. He walked to the wash basin, scrubbed his hands and face, and sat at the head of the table. He didn't say a word. He just waited. The boys slinked out of the shadows. taking their seats on the benches. They didn't wash their hands. Cora brought the skillet to the table. The hoe cake was blackened on the bottom and suspiciously pale on top. She hacked it into 4 pieces and slid them onto the tin plates, followed by a scoop of rehydrated, mushy, dried apples. She sat down. Silence stretched. Seth poked the burnt cornmeal with his finger. He looked up at Cora, his expression twisted in disgust. "Looks like cow shit," the 7-year-old said. Cora's jaw locked. "You will not use that language at the table." Seth picked up the burnt chunk of bread and threw it. It bounced off the center of the wooden table, leaving a greasy black smear. "I ain't eating it. It's poison." Cora's hands began to shake. It wasn't fear. It was pure, unadulterated rage. The stress of the fire, the humiliation of the proposal, the agonizing wagon ride, the smell of the buffalo robe, the sticky counters it all bottlenecked in her chest. She was not a saint. She was a 24-year-old woman who had lost everything. She stood up so fast, her chair scraped violently against the floorboards. She grabbed the cast-iron skillet and slammed it down onto the heavy oak table. The loud clang echoed like a gunshot. Both boys flinched, shrinking back. "Listen to me, you feral little creature," Cora snapped, leaning over the table, her voice trembling with barely controlled fury. "I did not ask to be here. I do not want to be here. But I am, and I spent an hour scraping your filth off these plates. So you will eat the burnt bread, and you will shut your mouth, or I swear to God I will let you go hungry until you are begging for it." The room went dead silent. The fire popped in the hearth. Cora stood there, breathing heavily, her chest heaving. Immediate regret flushed her cheeks with heat. She had lost her temper. She had yelled at a motherless child. She was a teacher. She was supposed to have infinite patience. She closed her eyes, waiting for Wyatt to stand up, to yell, to tell her to pack her trunk and get back in the wagon. Instead, there was a scraping sound. Cora opened her eyes. Wyatt had picked up his fork. He cut a piece of the blackened, raw-centered cornmeal, speared it, and put it in his mouth. He chewed slowly. His face betrayed absolutely no emotion. He swallowed. "Bread's burnt," Wyatt said quietly. He didn't look at Cora. He looked at his sons. "Eat your dinner," Wyatt told them. The command wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying gravity. Caleb glared at Cora, his eyes burning with hatred, but he picked up his fork. He took a bite. Seth, lower lip trembling slightly, picked up the chunk he had thrown and took a small, miserable bite. Cora slowly sank back into her chair. Her hands were still shaking beneath the table. She looked at her own plate. Her stomach, which had been gnawing at her for 2 days, suddenly rebelled. She couldn't eat. Later that night, the boys were asleep in the loft above the main room. Cora sat by the dying fire, wrapped in the horrific buffalo robe, staring at the glowing embers. The house was freezing again. The wind outside howled, a lonely, desperate sound. She heard a floorboard creak. Wyatt stepped out of the shadows. He had taken his boots off, moving silently for a man his size. He held 2 tin cups. He walked over and handed her one. It was chicory coffee, bitter, dark, and hot enough to scald her tongue. She took it with both hands, letting the heat seep into her cracked skin. Wyatt didn't sit. He stood by the mantel, leaning his massive shoulder against the stone, looking down at her. "You shouldn't have yelled at the boy," Wyatt said. His tone wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Cora stared into her cup. "I know. I'm sorry. I lost my temper. It won't happen again." "Didn't say I was angry," Wyatt replied. Cora looked up at him, confused. "They've chased off 2 hired girls in the last year," Wyatt said, taking a sip of his coffee. "Put a snake in one's bed, threw rocks at the other until she ran down the mountain crying. They expected you to cry." "I don't have anywhere to run to," Cora said softly, the cynical truth slipping out. Wyatt nodded slowly. The firelight caught the gray in his beard, casting deep shadows over his rugged face. He looked exhausted. For the first time, Cora saw past the intimidating bulk of the mountain man to the heavy weariness beneath. "They're testing you," Wyatt said. "They hate you because you aren't her, and they hate me because I brought you here. But they ate the bread." "It was awful," Cora admitted. a humorless huff escaping her lips. It was, Wyatt agreed flatly. But you stood your ground. I didn't buy a maid, Cora. I brought up a force of nature. Try not to break 'em, but don't let 'em break you either. He set his empty tin cup on the mantel. Your room is the door on the left, he said, turning to walk away. Blankets are in the chest. Put the latch on the door. Not because of me, because the wind blows it open. Cora watched his broad back retreat into the shadows of the hallway. She sat by the fire for a long time, the bitter taste of chicory in her mouth, listening to the wind try to tear the roof off. She wasn't a hero. She was just a woman trying not to freeze. But as she finally stood to go to her cold room, she realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was at war. Winter didn't just fall on the mountain, it entombed it. For 3 weeks, the sun was a rumor. The wind shrieked through the chinking in the logs, a relentless, high-pitched whine that settled in the back of Cora's skull and refused to leave. Her hands had changed. The ash-stained knuckles of a ruined teacher were gone. In their place were the red, cracked, lye-burned hands of a mountain wife. They smelled permanently of raw onions, wood smoke, and brown soap. She didn't hate it. The physical labor was a blunt instrument that bludgeoned her mind into a state of exhaustion, so profound she rarely had time to mourn her old life. The boys were a different kind of labor. Caleb fought her with a quiet, seething resentment, deliberately tracking mud across freshly scrubbed floorboards. Seth fought her with chaotic noise, refusing to look at his slateboard, throwing dried beans at the walls. Cora didn't try to mother them. She tried to outlast them. Cat, Cora said, pointing an ash-stained stick at the chalkboard Wyatt had hauled up from the valley. C-A-T. Spell it, Caleb. Caleb stared at the fire, his jaw set. He smelled of wet wool and defiance. Don't need letters to trap a badger. You do if you want to sell the pelt for what it's actually worth. Instead of getting robbed blind by the trader in town. Cora shot back, not missing a beat. Ignorance is a luxury for rich men, Caleb. You are not rich. Spell the word. He glared at her, but his eyes flicked to the board. C-A-T. Good. Cora tossed the stick onto the table. She was too tired to praise him. Wyatt had been gone since dawn. The timber on the north ridge needed clearing before the snow got too deep for the draft horses, leaving Cora alone with the boys and a woodpile that was looking dangerously low. I'm getting more wood, Caleb announced, standing up abruptly. His chair scraped loud enough to make Cora wince. Take the small hatchet, Cora ordered, turning to knead a lump of tough dough on the counter. Leave the splitting axe alone. It's too heavy for you. Caleb didn't answer. The heavy oak door slammed shut, rattling the iron hinges. Cora sighed, plunging her fists into the cold, sticky dough. She should have followed him out. She knew he wouldn't listen. But the cabin was finally warm, and her boots were wet, and for just 5 minutes, she wanted to exist without enforcing a rule. 10 minutes later, a scream shattered the mountain silence. It wasn't a child's tantrum. It was a high, thin